Greed, 1924 silent film based on a novel titled McTeague. It's a film that has a wild history, which is almost more interesting than the film itself. When it was being made, it was a massive undertaking. The director, Erich von Stroheim, insisted on shooting the movie exclusively on location, which was the first time ever that a feature film did that. All the other movies were shot on studio lots. He had a story which was this epic, sprawling thing taking care over decades with loads of extras and different locations. And he intended it to be fairly long. The director's cut ran for 4.5 hours. It was screened that way only one time for a select group of people. And then the producers said that they'd have none of it, and if they were to ever release the film in theaters, it would need to be much shorter. They ordered the editor to go essentially behind the back of the director and cut it down to just over 2 hours, which is basically only half of the original runtime. What's worse is they not only cut the rest of the film out, they took the unused footage and burned it. And that's because at the time the materials, the chemicals used for producing celluloid tape were fairly expensive, and the studio basically wanted to recycle, to melt it down and reuse it for a new film, hopefully. That unfortunately means that, unlike other similar stories where director's cuts varied from the theatrical ones, in this case we can never ever go back and view the intended version to compare them because it simply doesn't exist. The only copy was destroyed. This was a massive personal tragedy for Erich von Stroheim. He was devastated by what the studio did to his beloved creation. Then, decades later, in the 1970s, two things happened. One, the original script was recovered and published, containing descriptions of all the missing scenes. And two, a documentary crew that was preparing material for a film on Erich von Stroheim found an old cache full of stills and photographs from the movie's production. This paved the way for the eventual restoration of the film, which was made by combining the existing footage with the stills and static displays of text from the screenplay, which would help explain what's going on in the non moving scenes. The result is a very peculiar amalgam of a movie in a traditional sense and something more resembling a slideshow, a picture presentation. It ended up running for 3 hours and 50 minutes and is the best possible approximation of what the director's vision was. This is the version that I've seen. And I have to say, it's a very interesting experience. First of all, let's address the runtime. I would be lying if I said that the movie flies by, but it's also surprisingly brisk in terms of its pacing. I have seen other long movies which were much more boring. Somehow, Greed didn't feel as long as it actually was. I think partly because of its very nature. Remember that this is a silent film, so you'll often have a short scene of characters talking without words, and then for a few seconds you get a page of text that you have to read for yourself explaining the dialogue. What that means is the dialogue scenes essentially take twice as long in terms of the runtime because you separate the image from the text and need to go through both of them separately. But because it requires your attention, you sort of become more focused on what's going on, and it at times it almost becomes like reading a picture book. And somehow that worked for me. Second thing that I wanted to point out is that the storytelling itself, while certainly different than modern day movies, hasn't aged as much as may be expected. And that is because I think Greed was a pretty mature film to begin with for its time period. The story it's telling and the way it's doing that don't appear as old as the film itself. It's an engaging tale that makes you connect with the characters, believe them, and follow their fates with an emotional involvement. The story centers around three characters: dentist McTeague, his friend Marcus, and a girl named Trina. When we meet them, Marcus has some feelings for Trina, he's meeting up with her, but then McTeague meets the girl and he completely falls in love with her. Marcus ends up being, taking the high road, stepping aside so the other two eventually marry. And then Trina wins the lottery, $5,000 at the time, a massive fortune. And that changes everything. On the one hand, she becomes obsessed with money and with hoarding it and having more and more and more just for the sake of having money. And that erodes her relationship with McTeague and their lives become progressively worse. And Marcus himself is now jealous, not just in the romantic sense, but also feels entitled to the money, so there's tension there. What's also interesting is the director included two other parallel storylines, which were cut from the theatrical version and so now are only present mostly through photographs. They're quite crucial though, because each of them shows us a different couple living also near the McTeagues. One is an older couple who doesn't really care about the money in the slightest and they're just happy to be together. The other is a couple of scrap hunters running a junkyard who are even more greedy than the McTeagues and end up, you know, suffering a worse fate. These two storylines are meant to serve as alternate versions, so to speak, as different approaches in terms of personal philosophy to the theme of material wealth. So we have one couple who is completely above it, one who is defined by it, and then in the middle we've got McTeagues who are the one that has a choice to make whether or not they will let their greed ruin them. I think the three storylines work very well together, although the McTeague one is still the most prominent. It's well told with characters who are fleshed out but also evolve and change over the course of history, over the course of the story. It's technically well put together. It's actually kind of impressive how many different things are included in the film and how many filmmaking techniques were used in a movie that old. For instance, it was the first time ever that a sequence was filmed using a hidden camera, utilizing a real street with a real crowd of random people. All said and done, I'll be honest and say that going back to watch this film, particularly the restoration, is a pretty huge time investment for something that is still definitely less accessible than modern films. So I wouldn't recommend that everybody go and see it. But if you are interested in the history of filmmaking, this is definitely one of the movies worth going back to. It hasn't aged as much as other early movies. It can still be enjoyed as a piece of storytelling, and it is also one hell of a museum piece in the cinematic history.